background, I think, but it's my great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for this Youth Symposium Research Day. I'm presenting Dr. Anoop Nayak, who is a reader in social and cultural geography at Newcastle University in the UK. For all of those who want to know more detail about his biography, you can read the program. There's a biography at the back, but I happen to have met Anoop and have heard him speak quite recently in the UK at a conference we were both at. And he's doing very wonderful interdisciplinary research on youth cultures in the UK. His research areas are in the interest of race and ethnic studies, youth subcultures and social class formations, masculinities and social change, cultural studies and social theory. He is the author, and I had the privilege of reviewing this book for the British Sociology of Journal of Education, Race, Place and Globalization, Youth Cultures in a Changing World. He is co-editor of a book called Invisible Europeans, Black People in the New Europe with Les Back. His recent monograph with Mary Jane Kahili, who's also here in the room and presenting later today, entitled Gender, Youth and Culture, Young Masculinities and Femininities, published in 2008, explores the production, consumption, regulation and performance of gender in late modernity. Currently, Anoop is working on the politics of race, religion and asylum after 9/11. I think we're very lucky to have Anoop here, and we're really grateful he's come all this way to offer us the keynote. And as an exemplar case of interdisciplinary research, he's starting off the day. So with that, I'll pass it over to Anoop. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for such a warm invite. I should thank Handel in his absence. I've been getting emails from him, but I've never met him. And thanks especially to Joe and also Caroline for doing work on the ground here just to facilitate this whole thing, and of course for you, for all coming along to hear. Talk a little bit about some of the recent research I've been doing, as Joe said, on kind of the post 9/11 landscape. So this paper today is entitled Dark Matter: Race, Religion and Youth in Global Times. And in many ways it tries to address some of the complex articulations of race, religion and citizenship in the light of urban unrest in Britain in 2001, the destruction of the Twin Towers that year, and the aftermath of the London bombings in 2005. So it considers the contradictory ways in which Muslim youth, asylum seekers and other minorities have been positioned in the post 9/11 landscape. And I'm suggesting that a key fault line identified in political rhetoric is a kind of tension between a move towards a kind of global cosmopolitan multicultural identity against a more vituperative notion of assimilation and citizenship, which is trying to encase subjects in notions of Britishness. So there's a kind of tension there that I want to speak about today. And I'm going to argue that asylum seekers and refugees have a curious relationship in these new times as kind of not fully formed citizens, shadows on the landscape, if you like, that are moving in between the dark spaces of the city. So some of the insights that I'm raising will challenge perhaps some of the more postmodern, hybrid notions of identity, of mobility that we associate with late modernity. Instead, I want to focus more upon the power geometries of race, to consider the ways in which class, religion and colour fix people in time and space. So in many ways I'm arguing that minority groups are bodies out of place, dark matter that is challenging our claims of Britishness, whiteness and the nation state. So just by way of introduction, I just wanted to kind of give you a general picture really of what's going on in the UK. So I've got far too much detail on all of my slides, so just ignore the slides. I say this to students as well, ignore the slides, but they never do. They're here for prompts as much as anything. And yeah, so just to kind of fill you in on some of what's going on in the UK. I mean, most of the kind of migration to the UK have been from, have been kind of through the old kind of colonial links. So it have been South Asian communities, African Caribbean communities, you know, who are now kind of well established, you know, in the kind of post-war period. But recently, since the 90s, we've seen some remarkable changes. Not least of all, we've seen kind of a diversity of migrations, particularly with asylum and refugees and war in parts of Eastern Europe, such as Serbia and Croatia. So we're seeing a kind of changing landscape. But the myth, really, that Britain is awash with immigrants, which is kind of quite a familiar narrative in the UK. You know, if we look more closely at the figures, what we find is it's only since the mid-90s that more people have been coming into Britain than leaving it. Okay, so it's only relatively recently we've seen that tipping point move over. Okay, so this isn't like, so this is just a, you know, a slight change from the past. We've also seen with the development of the European Union a kind of new set of population movements. In having EU status, people from Poland, Lithuania, other EU countries can now move freely across those borders. So many of them, these folk come in as economic migrants. They might be seasonal workers, temporary workers. They might seek to be there permanently. Okay, so there's kind of haziness around that kind of diversity. So the story that I'm kind of citing this context within is really to say that this is kind of much more complex tapestry of migration than what we've been used to in the UK. And that is, you know, particularly compounded by these new changes. And one of the interesting things I found in my research is we've also encountered new racisms. So, I mean, I've been quite surprised the ways in which, for example, some of the members from Eastern Europe, from Poland, and so forth. I've been surprised and shocked to see black people in Britain, and I've reacted quite hostile ways because it's not their imaginative perception of Britain, which is, you know, it's a white kind of island, you know. So it's been kind of really intriguing to see these kinds of new forms of racism, along with these new forms of migration. And I suppose most critically, we have to position this within a kind of new geopolitics, where once the Soviet Union had been the kind of mysterious other in which world politics was positioned against. It's very clear that post 9/11, the new threat has been around, particularly around Islam and the racialization of South Asian bodies. So I'm going to pick up on a theme that I know Joe's very interested in, this notion of moral panic. And if we look at most of the kind of cultural studies research that's been done on race and ethnicity, a lot of it focused particularly upon African Caribbean youth in the 80s. This was in part driven by events at the time. There were riots in 1981 and 1985 in Britain, in multi-ethnic areas, and during this period, African Caribbean youth were marked out as a dark and dangerous other. They were seen as kind of other to a nation state and occupied a kind of hyper-masculine perception and discourse. They were dangerous, they were unruly, they were given to violence. This was the kind of rhetoric. Interestingly enough, if you look at the reports that come out at the time, Asian youth are not seen as problematic. They're actually constructed as a feminised race. The Swan report, an education report in '85, said Asians keep their heads down, referred to them as passive. So what I'm kind of arguing is that there's a complex intersectionality here between race, class, sexuality, gender that needs addressing. So we have on one hand a kind of hyper-masculine African-Caribbean youth that's in their imagination, and a feminised Asian youth in policy reports and stuff. Keep their heads down, no problem, passive, work hard. These kinds of stereotypes we use. And both of these were kind of deeply racially inflected perceptions. But that notion has come to be turned on its head, if you like, in recent times, post 9/11. We've seen Asian youth, particularly young Asian men, become the kind of repositories of danger and fear. So a kind of new moment of Orientalism in which Asian youth become revisited here, and by Asian in the UK we mean South Asian, those from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And associations like wearing a rucksack, having a beard, etc. become deeply racialised tropes in the UK. Okay, and particularly in London, going on the tube and stuff, there's all kinds of interesting gestures around clothing, around bodies, and new forms of racialisation. So I just wanted to point to the ways in which those forms of racialisation are reflected through notions of gender and sexuality. It was interesting, I thought I'd go back to kind of think about how South Asian youth were represented, as I said, in the 80s, but also what has changed sort of in 2001. And it was interesting that a kind of major report on, perhaps the major report, the Parrott report, which was entitled The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, was published in 2000. So this was just before 9/11 and just before riots in Britain. And it argued, I suppose it asked a really pertinent question. It said whether our ideas of Britishness will be about digging in, defending old values, ancient hierarchies, and relying upon a narrow English-dominated definition of the nation, or are we going to seize the opportunity to create a more flexible, inclusive, cosmopolitan image of ourselves? So in 2000, there was this possibility for reaching out to Europe, for kind of seeing a kind of mobile, cosmopolitan identity was no longer imbued with the baggage of colonialism and that particular history. So there was kind of a positive moment that I'm going to suggest has closed down since 2001. In 2001, we saw the largest riots in Britain since the 80s with African-Caribbean youth, and this took place in places, old northern towns, Bradford, Burnley, Oldham in particular. These are kind of small post-industrial towns located in the UK. What is interesting about these places is that they were also they're really old textile towns. They built their wealth upon cotton, in particular, wool in the case of Bradford, but basically old textile towns that no longer appear to have a function, and because they're very old working class areas, have not received the kind of urban regeneration that we associated with kind of larger cities. And it's in this moment, I think, that something interesting has happened. That Asian youth, and particularly Islam, has become associated with kind of fear, distrust, and this is happening at lots of levels. So at a local scale, it was what was going on in these impoverished areas. At a national scale, the London bombings played a key role, and then at a kind of global scale, we see 9/11 as kind of feeding back this kind of fear, insecurity, and emotion. So affect and emotion come to be part of the currency through which Islam, in particular, and South Asian youth get read. Sarah Ahmed's work on affect and race, I think, is quite instructive here, and fear. Claire Alexander has spoken about this as the kind of the signifying signs that come to form what becomes known as the Asian gang. So this is a kind of common trope in UK discourse now. It used to be the African Caribbean gangs. It used to be black gangs. Now it's Asian gangs. So, how did government read these urban uprisings? Well, it was interesting that the Home Secretary, David Blunkett, no longer in position, I'm glad to say, but he saw these riots as a failure of assimilation. He pointed in particular to the language barriers between communities, as he called it, and it was about difference, failure to assimilate. I mean, this was really puzzling to me because most of the young men that took to the streets were British born, spoke English perfectly well, were multilingual. Also, interestingly enough, the Commission for Race Equality, which is a unit in the UK, which is a progressive unit, I should say, to challenge racial discrimination. Trevor Phillips, the head of that organisation, also fell into this trap about assimilation. He said Britain is sleepwalking its way to segregation. A very dramatic statement that was pulling upon the way in which US cities are divided landscapes around race and class. But I think the situation in the UK is very different. We don't have that form of racial apartheid. And there's been work done by geographers such as Deborah Phillips at Leeds, Danny Dorling, a statistical geographer, who clearly show that actually the notion of racial segregation in the UK just doesn't exist in that way. Actually, if there is segregation, it's around social class. That people living in impoverished, deprived urban areas, regardless of their ethnicity, move out if they have that opportunity to do so. Okay, so mobility isn't restricted to race in the way that it might be in the US. So thinking about the disturbances, the riots, I wanted to find a new analytical lens through which to place that. And I suppose history is an important way of looking at that. It was interesting that none of the reports that were made ever connected these uprisings with the kind of colonial relations. You know, so we have to ask, they were taking place in old textile towns. Well, you know, cotton doesn't grow in Britain. You know, why are these people here? When did they come? You know, all these kinds of questions, these kind of post-colonial questions were kind of missed out. And it's almost as if the kind of arc of imperialism has come full circle, where migrant communities came in to work in the factories. These raw materials, cotton and so forth, were sold back to empire. And now, in the post-industrial moment, unemployment is a kind of shared experience, not only for South Asian communities, but for the white working class communities in these spaces. So very little there about connecting up people and place. Also, I found that absent within this discourse was any notion really of social class. Okay, so it was really about the race divide. And this is quite ironic, really, given that the government in their own report, and here I'm quoting really from their own Neighbourhood Renewal report, say that, you know, approximately 2/3 of black and minority ethnic, the term of UK policy term is BME, black and minority ethnic communities, 2/3 of them live in the 88 most deprived wards in Britain, compared to only 1/3 of white citizens. So here it's almost as if they recognise that there is some relationship to class, but none of this features in the kind of reading of these riots. And perhaps a third point that I want to kind of address here is that, as most of us, the scholars here will know, you know, race is of course a social construction, and what we witnessed in these accounts was a tendency to reify race, to make it as if real, to sum it to life in a particular way, so that particular communities, quote unquote, communities being a byword for South Asian communities, you know, as if they're kind of homogenous. We know, well, actually, you know, if you look at these areas, there's Punjabis, there's Gujaratis, there's Hindus, there's Muslims. I mean, you know, all of that gets collapsed into this larger identificatory process of a kind of alien wedge, an Islamic community resistant to change on one hand, and a white working class community that doesn't want them there. So this becomes a kind of polarised debate you know, if we look more closely, I mean, you could easily extrapolate another factor. You could say, well, actually, most of the people involved in these disturbances were young men, but masculinity doesn't come to the fore. Their age doesn't come to the fore. Most of them were working class. Class doesn't come to the fore. Race becomes the dominant trope to understand these disputes. So the work that I've been doing recently has been focused on in the northeast. This is the northeast for you. I thought you might like a map. Being a geographer, I thought it was important to kind of have a map at some point. I've been doing this work in Tyne and Wear, and I suppose all I want to say about it really is that it's a mainly white area. It's a white post-industrial area to a large extent. But just recently we've been seeing some interesting changes, due in part to the kind of EU enlargement I mentioned that was going on. And also the northeast has become there's a centre for the dispersal of asylum seekers. Okay, so there's certain centres in various places, and the northeast is one of those. So even though it's a mainly white area, it's seeing some rapid changes in a relatively short space of time. I won't go into too much of the details there. I'll also miss out methodology because that tends to be pretty boring, but if anyone wants to ask me questions about that, you can. In terms of the kind of people that we spoke to 187 respondents from minority ethnic backgrounds, and this included asylum seekers, refugees, and so forth. Now within this area, it doesn't sound a large amount, but within this area it actually is. And we spoke to slightly more women than men, which is actually quite interesting because most of the government research that gets done tends to actually go through what are called community leaders. And these tend to be self-appointed, older, patriarchal men, okay, that take charge and speak for their community. We consciously wanted to get beyond that because they actually, I don't think they represent anybody really other than themselves. So it was really important to get beneath that, and particularly to look at what young people have to say, what women have to say, and so forth. So our sample was fairly diverse. About a third of people were in full-time employment, a quarter in education, a fifth full-time employed, a fifth unemployed, and about 10% were asylum seekers that were seeking refugee status. So legally that means they're not allowed to work. Okay, so these are really the kind of abject figures of the nation state. Okay, they don't have citizenship, they don't have rights. In terms of kind of the ethnicities of the group, and here we use, and it's problematic, but we use the kind of UK census data nevertheless. We thought it was useful just to get a gauge on that. And the only thing I would kind of draw attention to here that was interesting was that the second largest group came from white or any other white background. And I think this reflects some of the changes around ethnicity and migration in the UK. But there's a real uncertainty around this, and we just have this kind of monolithic category white that we don't know much about. So part of what I'm suggesting is that, you know, terms like, which is used in the UK, BME, black and minority ethnic, actually don't capture some of these new forms of migration. And I think questions of whiteness and questions of religion are going to come to the fore in debates on race and ethnicity in coming times. But it was interesting that a large majority of people felt they were from minority groups but positioned themselves as white other. Okay. So what did we find? Well, I suppose what became most evident was that asylum seekers and refugees were the kind of abject bodies of the nation state. They really were the most isolated and had the highest levels of fear and endured the worst conditions. They were also a source of hatred for the British national press, asylum seekers, but this is a really kind of big debate here in the UK, and it's particularly pushed by right-wing media, and it's also actually then embodied by many middle-class people. So you've got, even though Britain's quite a liberal country, you've actually got a kind of a sense that we're being overwhelmed. And these kind of terms of being overwhelmed, being swamped, being taken over, kind of feature time and time again in discourse. And it's interesting how those words carry with them particular meanings that resonate over time and space. So those kind of effective economies, to use Sarah Armand's words, become the ways in which immigration becomes understood in the UK. Okay? It circulates around these words. It resonates, it picks up on feelings, emotions, difference. So these kind of feelings, people's gut feelings, become the ways that they understand their neighbourhood, their changing neighbourhood. Things are getting worse. Okay? But there's a number of myths surrounding asylum seekers and immigration. So a lot of the kind of discourse is around the fact that they are seen as lazy, as getting free housing, as work shy. So despite the fact that they're legally not allowed to work, these discourses perpetuate. And it's amazing how that is allowed to happen, really, you know. And it's this kind of curious thing where on one level they're seen as kind of work shy and avoiding work, yet on the other they're also seen as driving down wages, of taking work in the kind of illegal black economy. Now this does happen at moments, but nevertheless there's very little research on this because it's very difficult to actually access that. So it is very much about feelings, affect, emotions, and people's everyday intuitive sense of place. Okay? So this is really about the kind of ways in which people imagine the landscape and imagine their neighbourhood. Okay? So I'm not suggesting that there's any truth to this, but this is about kind of tapping into how people experience or feel they experience the changing world in which they live. Okay? So the fact that, for example, migrant communities uphold most of the kind of public services in the UK, bus drivers, taxi drivers, waiters, hospital workers, etc., kind of gets omitted from that. Okay. So, what did we find in our research? Well, we found that racism was a kind of continuum for most of the respondents. About 2/3 of them had all experienced a racist incident in the UK. The term racist incident, I should say, we use a definition that was the kind of police definition. Okay, so we now kind of, the police and the government monitor racist incidents. So we use their same definition. We also found that in this research, young people featured quite heavily in terms of racist incidents, of being victims often, and also perpetrators, because we also found that most of the kind of interactions were between young people themselves. And it seemed that, in particular, it was those that were asylum seekers that had the highest level of vulnerability, and then other minority groups, and women and young people, a little bit lower down the line. So just a couple of kind of vignettes to kind of capture that. A young Iranian male refugee says, well, there's no sports and leisure and cultural facilities here. Race relations are just not very good. I don't even know my neighbours. A young Muslim woman who was studying for a PhD said, you know, a drunk passed me by on the zebra crossing. This is like Pelican Crossing in the UK. In Newcastle, I was out with my dad. He was visiting me at university, and I was wearing a scarf because I'm Muslim. The drunk said to his friend, let this terrorist sister pass. His friend, who was not drunk, actually apologised. And I was upset because my father will now worry about me living in this place. And it was interesting actually that in many of the camps people still saw Britain as a friendly place. Many of the migrants didn't, even though they had racist incidents, they still saw it as quite friendly. So she was at pains to say, well, actually his friend wasn't like this. And so, you know, it wasn't that they carried this baggage of feeling victims, you know. An Iranian male who was working part-time as a medical doctor said, verbal abuse, yeah, that happens just everywhere. I've been attacked twice in Byker, which is an area in Newcastle. Once I was making a phone call with an international calling card. 4 white girls were wanting to use the phone. I avoided looking at them, but they seized the opportunity and grabbed the phone, then hit me on the head and face with it and ran away. I called for an ambulance and spent the night in hospital. So I think that vignette kind of captures in many ways some of the contradictions of globalisation. We associate it with this kind of transnationalism, with making international calls, mobility and so forth. But I'm suggesting that it really needs to be rooted in these kind of power geometries of race and religion at the local level. Okay? So a lot of the kind of more kind of postmodern accounts have tended perhaps to, I think, overemphasise this kind of notion of transculturalism at the expense of kind of the material realities of living with multiculturalism. One of the interesting things that came out of the research was that a lot of minority groups, in order to get government funding and support, actually have to present themselves as being from a particular community. So in order to get funds, you have to say, well, from the South Korea community, we need a youth club, or for South Korean youth, or whatever, or whatever. And so this kind of notion, while it's has been quite effective for minority groups to assert rights and gain some advancements in the public sector, it's come at a certain cost. It's come at a cost to white working class communities who perceive this as special treatment that minorities are getting. So they then have to carry the brunt of that hatred and disaffection. But also it's come at the cost of tending to kind of position them as only having this minority identity, so as not being British in some way. So it was interesting in the responses that the people themselves felt this had a constraining effect upon them. A young Muslim woman who is of mixed heritage said, well, there could be an organisation focusing on the needs of multicultural communities, not specifically targeting BME groups, because it's causing division. A woman from a Persian community said, we need to organise events and, social and cultural ones to boost people's knowledge so we can understand one another better. We need to provide race equality and integration. We need to make people feel part of society as human beings, not as BME people. So this again kind of adds to that sense. And it was also interesting speaking to some of the Islamic groups who are positioned as being closed, as being parochial, as being inward-looking, that actually my experience of interviewing them was that they wanted to actually have more connections with white British communities and others. So this comment was pretty germane. Said there should be centres where all kinds of people can come together and socialise to understand one another better. I tried to do this by asking local British people to come to our centre and to see what we're truly like. But one or two persons doing that, it's just not enough. So the idea that it's an Islamic centre can also kind of make people think, well, if you're not Islamic, then you can't go there. So curious things around service provision, and this is happening in youth clubs, in places of worship, and so on. So it's creating particular divides. I really wanted to kind of think about then what is happening in neighbourhood spaces. And again, it's far too much detail here. I'm just going to use this as a prompt. And I was kind of interested in the ways in which a lot of academic literature I was reading was talking very much about a global sense of place, to use Doreen Massey's term. She talks in particular about neighbourhoods as meeting places. And in an essay on global sense of place, she famously goes through almost takes the reader through a kind of walking tour of her borough in North London, Kilburn High Street, and talks about how it's really connected up to many different places. You can buy an Irish newspaper, you could sounds of Punjabi music, Bhangra music is coming from taxis coming past, and it's a really kind of busy, chaotic, interesting place. But I want to say that that's very particular to North London. North London is kind of quite an affluent part of London, and it's also very multi-ethnic. I don't think it's anything like Bradford, Burnley and Oldham, those kind of predominantly white, post-industrial areas with South Asian communities living alongside. So that kind of global sense of place sits uneasily then with some of the kind of work that I've been doing kind of on the ground in these kind of working class neighbourhoods. So I found it kind of difficult to use some of the very interesting and rich ethnographic work that's emphasised hybridity and cultural syncretism and match this with kind of quite a divided landscape. Interestingly enough, some of the policy reports have reflected on what they call parallel lives, and this is a kind of term that's captured the imagination in the UK. The Ousley report referred to parallel lives. This was trying to understand what happened post-2001 disturbances, and it said that basically it was saying that Islamic communities, it said South Asia, it really meant Islamic, South Asian communities were living parallel lives with white working class communities. In other words, they worshipped at separate places, they went to separate schools, used separate leisure facilities, lived alongside one another like tram lines, but never crossed. So this has become quite a kind of important metaphor in the UK. And again, I think there's something in that, but what we actually found was that might be restricted to one or two streets in a neighbourhood. It couldn't be used to account for, certainly couldn't be used to account for a community or a small town or city. It's much more complicated than that. So here we have two different narratives. One is the parallel lives, split communities, and the other is kind of this global sense of place, cosmopolitanism, integration going on. And I want to suggest that perhaps both of these interpretations are slightly outer scale images. Okay, they tell us something about what might be happening, but they really don't capture kind of more complex openings and closures around community that are evoked every day. So we found actually that symbolic openings and closures around who was in the community and who wasn't could be happening at interpersonal levels all the time. So kind of trying to move to a more kind of complex way of understanding how these positionings happen. And local events could shape that as well. So if there was an attack in a neighbourhood, that could lead to new senses of fear and affect that create other boundaries that get drawn. So I think we need to be much more open about that. Interestingly enough, like I said, the North East has a heritage that's built upon shipbuilding, coal mining, and heavy engineering. Okay, a really kind of tough industrial place. That has now virtually gone. There's still some industry remaining, but the push has been towards a kind of more feminised economy, the service sector economy. Culture and the arts are predominant now, and urban regeneration has led to kind of new modalities of being in this particular place. So a heavy masculine area that is now having to adjust to a kind of more feminised, softer economy, if you like. But also interesting positionings were going on. We found that, for example, that not only were South Asian communities seen as dark, dangerous others, but the working class community were also being positioned in new times as being out of place, okay, not fitting with the kind of new moment of neoliberal regeneration. So they were also cast as problematic. Okay, so in some of the kind of estates we went into, they were seen as a kind of residual other, a left behind other that didn't feature in any kind of publicity, any tourist publicity, anything like that. And many of the kind of new places, there's been a lot of development around the waterfronts in many UK cities, and Newcastle is one of them. Art centres and so forth just wouldn't service those people. And I actually asked many of the young people about these spaces, and they knew next to nothing about them. Okay, they weren't part of their cultural habitus, to use Bourdieu's term. Interestingly enough, I think these areas are also, these working class neighbourhoods, they're also the kind of, historically have always been the hotbeds of cultural change. They're always the spaces where immigrants flock to. Okay? So the idea that the white working class communities aren't adaptable to change, I think is a myth. There might be, racism there, and it certainly happens at street level, but these places have always had to deal with that. Okay, so it's not the nice middle class suburbs that ever have to deal very much with multiculturalism. And Bridget Byrne has done some work in education on this. She's looked at how, in London, how schooling choice is one of the ways in which white suburban Londonites effect a kind of code of whiteness. Okay, so her work has been based on white mothers who actually talk about positively about multiculturalism. They like it. They like a little bit of multiculturalism, a taste of the other. They like to have nice restaurants, ethnic restaurants, as they're often called. But interesting enough, they actually still want to maintain a kind of dominance of whiteness. And school choice is one of the ways in which they do that. So not sending your child to a kind of urban multicultural school. And those kinds of middle-class inflections happen often around school choice. In the northeast, it's around property. People choose to buy houses, own property in these areas. So white flight has been a kind of issue from kind of older urban areas, kind of more multi-ethnic sectors. So I just wanted to kind of really situate these, I suppose I'm calling them really sort of performances of whiteness as through social class as well. Because all too often I think it's the white working class that become positioned as inflexible to change. Okay, so in trying to understand these dynamics, I've suggested here that some of the work that's been done on race, affect and emotion can be particularly instructive. Not because it tells us about the reality of race, but it captures the everyday feelings, the senses of place, how people feel about a neighbourhood, an event, a practice, and it captures something about that. It tells us, in Said's terms, about the way in which an imagined geography of the nation operates. Benedict Anderson has spoken about the kind of banal nationalism. In other words, here, his idea of banal nationalism refers to the everyday forms of nationalism which are conducted. So that could be like schooling choice, things that, it's not about flag waving, it's not about getting out and voting for the British National Party, a far-right party in the UK. It's about the everyday performances and practices of the nation that we get involved with. So while I've kind of found some of the work on affect and emotion quite useful, I'm kind of keener to kind of look at the way in which material cultures, the political economy, intersects with culture. And here I found Raymond Williams's work, his notion of structures of feeling, much more evocative really, because I think it embeds it within social class relations. His idea of structures of feeling captures notions of Gramscian kind of hegemonic productions in that landscape. So, how am I doing for time? Am I running over?
About
10 minutes. Wow, that's pretty good. Well, I think I can certainly round up, maybe even 5. Short and sweet. Okay, so some issues for the future. These are kind of reflections really that I've been using to kind of think through some of what has been happening. Paul Gilroy has spoken about whether we should leave the concept of race behind, that actually it entraps us in certain ways. And I think some of those reflections that were coming out from people from Islamic communities and so forth that were saying, well, we have to go apply for money in this way and so forth, I think shows some of that tension. Excuse me, but I'm not really sure how far that can take us beyond a kind of useful theoretical level. Post-race theory, kind of which is premised upon moving beyond the category of race, so you kind of, would say, well, we invoke race in everyday life, and why? It would probably criticise some of the research I've done here, which has used census categories, because it would say, well, race is meaningless. Why you even bother to deploy them? I think there's something interesting in that, and it kind of taps into some of the ways in which I said the kind of Parrott report on the future of multi-ethnic Britain was beginning to talk about this new cosmopolitan moment, and say, is it possible to reimagine Britain as a nation or a post-nation in a multicultural way? And I think at the imaginary level, those are very powerful ways of thinking. Post-race theory offers us other ways of doing race, and maybe even undoing it. But it's kind of difficult to actually, I think, put that into an empirical context, to kind of forget race or to leave it behind. I think those traces carry forward into different moments. Okay, so we've seen in the history of race how I spoke about the ways in which African-Caribbean youth are positioned as other, and now that those kind of race signs are being proliferated around the bodies of South Asian youth. I think making those connections is essential. So that historical way of looking, I think, is an important interpretive device. So my argument really is that while race might not be real, it's a sign, it's an artifice, it's a fabrication. Its effects certainly are, okay, because it's about the way people understand those signs, what they make happen with them. So race, in this sense, is a sticky sign. It adheres itself to bodies, to practices, to events, by which I mean, that could be simply a minority group, someone from a minority group, having a car. That can be seen, the kind of distrust around that is incredible. Some of the stories I've been getting, that's immediately associated with drugs and dealing, and there's all kinds that carries into a register of effect on emotion. So lots of interesting discursive work that can be done around objects, around people, property, all sorts of stuff. So race may not be real, but its effects are. I think that's probably as far as I'd want to go with that post-race stuff. I've suggested that issues of whiteness are going to come to the fore, but perhaps we need different ways for understanding race, and to recognise in particular that, to quote Alistair Bonnet, whiteness is in many ways seen as the other of ethnicity. White people are not seen to have an ethnicity, yet what we're finding now is we're actually finding that at least some white people are identifying themselves as having an ethnicity and positioning themselves even as a minority group. I also think that we need to look more closely at some of the fascinating ethnographic research that's being done, which is, I'm broadly calling new ethnicities research, and this is a term that Stuart Hall used in the 90s. There's been a number of ethnographies and neighbourhood ethnographies by writers like Les Back, Phil Cohen, Roger Hewitt, Claire Alexander on kind of multi-ethnic neighbourhoods in the UK. They've used those kind of notions of hybridity, syncretism, and so forth. I think some really vibrant, interesting stuff there, but somehow that needs to perhaps come a little bit closer to these power geometries of race and religion that I've spoken about, where bodies are also fixed in time and space. So I suppose a question really that this leads me to, and there's been a lot of government push on notions of social cohesion, community cohesion, and I suppose I'm left to wonder, firstly, whether actually this can be politically engineered, because the government certainly is trying to do that. It's set up a social cohesion unit. There's all kinds of policies to achieve this. Whether that can actually happen, I'm not sure about. How do you actually do that? How do you actually make people get on with one another? Seems a curious thing to actually engineer. And I also think, is it an impossibility where, if we do live in a kind of if we do have a global sense of place, then, for example, the fact that, there's war going on in Iraq, how is it possible to establish good ground relations between Islamic people and others? Okay, so there's a real kind of conceit, I think, around placing the blame upon individuals at a kind of local scale, when clearly there's so much disharmony going on, in terms of geopolitics. Okay, so and it's almost as if these different scales refuse to speak to one another. So within that context, I've hopefully tried to point to the kind of uneven landscape of social class in the post-9/11 environment, and argued for a kind of, I suppose, a more closer sense to look at the kind of different symbolic openings and closures around which community happens. So I'm using community here, not as a kind of noun, but as a verb, as a practice or a performance. A community is constantly changing, is constantly evolving. It's a term that is about relationships, and relationships are always mobile. So those kind of configurations are always in the happening, they're always in the making. So I'm suggesting that looking at people's everyday experiences actually offers a rich ethnographic way of getting beyond the kind of stark monochrome geographies of race that dominate in the post 9/11 landscape. Okay, I'll leave it there.